world is ending. Or at least, the world as Emperor Justinian knows it is ending. From inside the cold stone heart of the great palace of Constantinople, the air is thick with the acrid stench of smoke and the sound of his own city screaming for his blood. It is January of the year 532, and the Nika revolt is at its zenith. The mob, a howling, united beast, born from the city's chariot racing factions, has already burned half of the capital to the ground. The Hagia Sophia itself is a column of fire. Senators, smelling weakness, are preparing to crown a new emperor. Inside the imperial council chamber, the most powerful men in the Roman world are breaking. Flickering torchlight dances across faces slick with the sweat of fear. These are the men who command legions, who draft laws for millions, who hold the fate of civilization in their hands. And they are whispering of escape. John the Cappadocian, the empire's treasurer, a man whose cruelty is legendary, argues that their lives are worth more than the throne. Belisarius, the greatest general of his age, knows his few loyal soldiers cannot hold back the tide of an entire city's hatred. The escape route is planned. A ship waits in the palace harbor, ready to spirit them away into the humiliating safety of exile. Justinian, the emperor of Rome, the man chosen by God, is about to run. And then a voice cuts through the panicked murmurings. It is not the voice of a general, a senator, or a priest. It is the voice of a woman. She rises from her seat, her presence silencing the room more effectively than any imperial decree. Every eye turns to Empress Theodora. She was not supposed to be here. She was not born to this life. She was the scandal of the empire, the living embodiment of everything this pious, rigid society claimed to despise. And yet, as the men around her crumble, she is the only one who remains unbroken. She looks at her husband, at his terrified advisors, and she speaks the words that will echo through eternity. "My lords," she begins, her voice steady, each word a perfectly weighted stone dropped into a pool of chaos. Whether or not a woman should give an example of courage to men is neither here nor there. At a moment of desperate danger, one must do what one must. I think that flight, even if it brings us to safety, is not in our interest. Every man born to see the light of day must die, but that one who has been emperor should become a fugitive is not to be born. She pauses, letting the shame settle upon the men in the room. "I will not be separated from this purple," she says, gesturing to the imperial robes that adorn her, "and I hope I may never live to see the day when I am no longer saluted as Empress." Her gaze sweeps across the council, pinning each man in place. "If you wish to save yourself, my lord, there is no difficulty. We are rich. Over there is the sea, and yonder are the ships. But consider whether, once you have escaped to a place of security, you will not prefer death to safety." Then comes the final, devastating blow. The declaration that will turn the tide of history. "For myself," she concludes, her voice ringing with a conviction that borders on terrifying, "I agree with the ancient saying that purple makes a fine shroud. Royal purple is a beautiful burial cloth." In that moment, a choice was made. Shamed and galvanized by her raw courage, Justinian stayed. Belisarius and the other generals, their honor restored by the will of a woman they once scorned, went out and did the impossible. The revolt was crushed in a tide of blood. The throne was saved. The empire endured. But it was not saved by the emperor. It was saved by the empress. It was saved by Theodora. This single act of defiance has defined her legacy. But it also begs the most important question. Who was this woman? How did a person from the absolute lowest rung of Byzantine society, the daughter of a bear-keeper, an actress whose name was a byword for vulgarity, a courtesan and prostitute whose past was so scandalous it had to be legally erased, develop a will of iron so absolute that it could stare down the inferno and make an emperor's courage return. To understand Theodora, we cannot merely look at her life. We must dissect the world that created her. For she was not an exception to the brutal, hypocritical, and ritualistic society of Byzantium. She was its ultimate, most terrifying product. Her entire life, from the gutters of the Hippodrome to the back rooms of the theater, was a deadly education in the mechanics of power, humiliation, and survival. The very rituals designed to keep her and those like her powerless were the very things that forged her into a weapon. This is not the story of a woman who escaped her world. This is the story of how the most shocking intimate rituals of Byzantium accidentally forged its deadliest empress. Before she was empress, before she was the wife of an emperor, before she was even a woman, Theodora was a creature of the Hippodrome. To a modern mind, this might sound like saying she grew up at a stadium or a racetrack. This is a profound failure of imagination. The Hippodrome of Constantinople was not a venue for sport. It was the roaring, blood-soaked, politically charged heart of the entire Roman world. It was a cathedral of chaos, a furnace of human emotion, and for a child with nothing to her name, it was the most brutal and effective school in existence. It was here, amidst the roar of the crowd and the stench of animal dung and spilled wine, that Theodora would learn her first lessons in the savage curriculum of survival. Her first lesson was in the nature of humiliation. It began with a death. Her father, Acacius, was a bear keeper for the Green faction, one of the two great chariot racing syndicates that dominated the city. His job was to care for the animals used in the bloody spectacles between races. It was a lowly position, but it was a living. And then, one day, it wasn't. He died suddenly, leaving his wife and 3 young daughters, Comito, Theodora, and Anastasia, utterly destitute. In the rigid, unforgiving world of Byzantium, the widow of a low-ranking functionary had no safety net. Her husband's position, their only source of income, was now vacant and would be given to another man. They were days, perhaps hours, away from starvation. What happened next was not a tragedy, it was a ritual. It was a calculated act of public self-abasement, orchestrated by a desperate mother who knew the rules of this world far better than her children. She dressed her 3 little girls, Theodora, likely no older than 5 or 6, in simple tunics. She placed garlands of flowers on their heads and Phyllis in their tiny hands, dressing them not as beggars, but as supplicants in a religious drama. Then she led them out from the shadows and into the heart of the monster itself. Imagine the scene. The Hippodrome is a chasm of carved stone and humanity, capable of holding 100,000 people. The air is electric with the manic energy of the Green faction, screaming for their champions. And into this cauldron of noise and fury walks a woman with 3 small children. They walk to the section of seats where the Green's faithful roar, and there, on the stone steps, Theodora's mother instructs them to prostrate themselves. They lay face down on the ground, their flower crowns brushing against the filth of the floor, their small hands outstretched, begging not for money, but for a job, for the right to continue serving the faction that their father had served until his death. This was Theodora's first public performance, and its lesson was searingly clear. Dignity is a luxury. Pride is a food you cannot eat. Your shame, your vulnerability, your very self are all commodities that can be traded for survival. The mob does not pity you. The powerful do not care for you. You must make them acknowledge you, and if that requires the ritual sacrifice of your own self-respect in front of thousands of strangers, then that is the price. The Greens ignored the plea, and the job was given to another man. But the rival Blue faction, seeing a chance for a public relations victory, granted Theodora's mother the post. The lesson was sharpened, Your humiliation is not only a tool for survival, but a weapon of a political theater. One faction's rejection is another's opportunity. Theodora learned, on that hard stone floor, that even the lowest of the low could play the game. Her second lesson was about the language of violence. The factions that controlled the Hippodrome, the Blues and the Greens, were not simply sports teams. They were a bizarre fusion of street gangs, political parties, and religious cults. They had their own colors, their own chants, their own leaders, and their own armies of loyal thugs. Their rivalry extended far beyond the racetrack, spilling into the streets of Constantinople in waves of riots, assassinations, and gang warfare. To support a color was to declare a political and even a theological allegiance. The Blues were generally seen as the party of the aristocracy and Orthodox Chalcedonian Christianity. The Greens were the party of the common people, the merchants, the artisans, and often of the monophysite Christian sects that the state deemed heretical. To grow up in the shadow of the Hippodrome was to be fluent in this language of sectarian violence. Theodora saw how a disputed race could escalate into a citywide riot within minutes. She saw how the crowd could adore a charioteer as a god one moment and lynch a magistrate the next. She learned that the mob was not a mindless beast. It was a weapon, and the men who knew how to aim it held a power that could rival the emperor's own. She absorbed the rhythm of its fury, the calculus of its loyalties. She understood that in Constantinople, a riot was simply politics by other means. The cheers for a victorious charioteer were not just about sport, they were a roar of defiance against the ruling class. The burning of a public building was not just arson, it was a petition written in fire. This was an education in raw, unadulterated power. Not the polished power of the court, but the visceral, unpredictable power of the street. It taught her how to read a crowd, to sense the shift in its mood, to understand what it wanted, what it feared, and what could make it kill. Her third, and perhaps most crucial lesson was that all power is a performance. High above the chaos of the track and the stands sat the kathisma, the imperial box. It was connected directly to the palace, a divine skybox from which the emperor and his court would watch the races. But the emperor was not a mere spectator. His presence was a mandatory ritual, the central act in the grand political theater of the empire. Here, he was not shielded from his people. He was exposed to them. The 100,000 souls in the arena could petition him, praise him, and, if he displeased them, curse him to his face. From her vantage point in the dirt and the grime below, the young Theodora could look up and see this performance unfold. She saw the emperor as an actor on the grandest stage of all. She watched as he carefully calibrated his waves, his smiles, his reactions to the races. A victory for the wrong color could spark a riot if the emperor seemed too pleased. A tax increase announced a week prior could result in a hail of stones if he appeared arrogant. The emperor and the mob were locked in a dangerous symbiotic dance. He was their ruler, but they were his audience, and a poor performance could cost him his life. Theodora learned that power, even the absolute power of a Roman emperor, was not a static fact. It was a story being told, a constant, nerve-wracking negotiation between the ruler and the ruled. It had to be performed, displayed, and reinforced every single day. The emperor's purple robes, his divine retinue, his carefully choreographed appearances, all of it was a costume, a set, for the most important show on earth. She, a child of the gutter, understood this in her bones. She, who was learning to perform for her very survival, could recognize a master class when she saw one. The Hippodrome taught her that the distance between the prostrate child begging on the floor and the enthroned emperor in his box was not as great as it seemed. Both were performers. The only difference was the scale of the stage and the stakes of the performance. This was her primary education. The Hippodrome was the crucible that burned away her innocence, but forged something far more durable in its place. It was a relentless teacher of human nature in its rawest form. It taught her that shame is a currency, violence is a language, and power is a carefully managed illusion. The lessons were brutal, but they were essential. They were the foundation upon which the future empress would be built. The Hippodrome had been her cage, but it had also been her classroom. And now, armed with this savage knowledge, she was ready to graduate to her next stage. If the Hippodrome was Theodora's primary school, the theaters and bedrooms of Constantinople were her university, a brutal and advanced institution for the study of human depravity and the mechanics of desire. Having mastered the psychology of the mob, she now had to master the psychology of the individual, specifically the powerful men who ruled the city. She graduated from the vast, roaring stage of the arena to the smaller, more intimate, and infinitely more dangerous stages of the theater and the brothel. Here, the lessons were not written in law books or taught by scholars. They were inscribed on her own flesh, learned through rituals of institutionalized debauchery and transactions of whispered secrets, rituals that would either destroy her or arm her with an understanding of men that no empress had ever possessed. Her first new classroom was the Byzantine theater, and the first ritual was the complete and total annihilation of modesty. We must be clear about what an actress or a mime was in this era. This was not a respected profession of high art. It was the absolute lowest occupation a woman could hold, legally and socially ranked alongside prostitutes and brothel keepers. The theaters were not places of sophisticated drama. They were licensed cesspits, pressure valves for the city's overflowing lust and perversion, where the fantasies of the elite were acted out for the entertainment of the masses. It was here that Theodora became a star. Our most vivid, though undeniably hostile account comes from the historian Procopius, a man who loathed Theodora with a passion that bordered on obsession. Whether his descriptions in his infamous secret history are the literal truth or a character assassination poisoned by malice, they reveal the nature of the world she had to conquer. He writes that Theodora was not a musician or a dancer in the traditional sense. She was a performer of mime, a form of burlesque theater that relied on physical comedy, vulgarity, and explicit nudity. She was, by his account, fearless in her shamelessness, a master of a kind of performance art designed to shock and titillate a jaded audience. Her most legendary act, a grotesque and blasphemous parody of a sacred myth, became the talk of the city. It was her version of Leda and the Swan. According to Procopius, she would appear on stage, almost completely nude, and lie on her back. Servants would then scatter grains of barley over her groin, and specially trained geese would come forward and pick the grains from her body with their beaks. This was not a performance hidden in a back alley. This was a headline act performed in the heart of the capital of the Christian world. The modern mind recoils, searching for a way to process this. But to understand Theodora, we must look beyond the shock and see the lesson. This was a ritual of absolute objectification, yet in her hands it became a strange form of power. She was not a passive victim on that stage, she was a conductor, a maestro of male desire. She was learning, in the most extreme way imaginable, how to command the unwavering attention of a room full of powerful men. She was learning how to hold their gaze, how to manipulate their focus, how to make them see exactly what she wanted them to see. She was mastering the art of being underestimated, of using their perception of her as a mere object of lust to mask the sharp, calculating mind that was watching them right back. While they saw a naked body, she saw a room full of weaknesses, ambitions, and exploitable appetites. The stage taught her that a woman's body, in a world run by men, could be a prison, but if wielded with enough intelligence and a complete absence of fear, it could also be a devastating weapon. From the public stage of the theater, she moved to the private stage of the courtesan's bed. This was the second ritual, and her postgraduate education, the mastery of secrets as currency. Theodora was no common streetwalker. She became a high-class courtesan, a hetaira, a woman whose company was sought by the city's elite. And in the perfumed lamplit rooms where she entertained these men, she began her most important work. The bedchamber became her intelligence-gathering agency. The pillow became her library. While other future rulers studied military strategy and legal theory, Theodora was studying the unvarnished truth of the men who ran the empire. In moments of post-coital vulnerability, in drunken confessions, in the careless boasting of men seeking to impress her, the secrets of Constantinople bled out. A senator might reveal his crippling debts or his secret alliance with a rival of the emperor. A general might let slip his frustration with a military campaign or his contempt for a fellow commander. A wealthy merchant might expose the illegal sources of his fortune or the officials he had bribed. For Theodora, this was not gossip. This was data. She was not just a participant in these encounters, she was an anthropologist of power. She learned to listen, to probe, to connect disparate pieces of information. She was building a vast, intricate mental map of the city's entire power structure, a web of debts, loyalties, rivalries, and hidden crimes. Every secret was a coin deposited in a bank of future influence. Every confession was a thread she could one day pull. She learned that the desires men publicly condemned were the very levers that privately controlled them. She saw that piety was often a mask for perversion, and the declarations of loyalty could conceal plots of treason. This education was more valuable than any formal schooling. It gave her a PhD in human nature, with a specialization in the hypocrisy of powerful men. She was no longer just a performer reacting to an audience. She was becoming a strategist, accumulating the ammunition she would one day need to wage her own wars. But her education was not complete. She needed one final, brutal lesson. The third ritual was that of abandonment and rebirth. At the height of her success as a courtesan, she caught the eye of a man named Hippodrome, a respectable official from Tyre who was appointed governor of a province in North Africa. For Theodora, this must have seemed like the ultimate escape. She became his official mistress and accompanied him to his new post. She had traded the sordid stage of Constantinople for a life of relative luxury and quasi-respectability. She had, for a moment, attached her fate to a powerful man, and that was her mistake. In Africa, far from her network and her home turf, the relationship soured. Hippodrome, for reasons history does not record, grew tired of her. Perhaps her past was an embarrassment, or her intelligence a threat, and he did what powerful men in his position always did. He threw her away. He abandoned her in Alexandria, thousands of miles from home, penniless and disgraced. This was the ultimate ritual of powerlessness, the brutal culmination of a life spent depending on the whims of men. This was the moment that should have broken her. Instead, it was the moment she was truly forged. Stranded in Alexandria, the intellectual and spiritual heart of a restless part of the empire, Theodora underwent a profound transformation. The lesson was burned into her soul with the fire of absolute humiliation. Power borrowed from a man is not power at all. It is a leash. To be truly free, to be truly secure, she had to build a foundation that was entirely her own. And so she began to do just that. Her journey back to Constantinople was not a quick one. She traveled through the great cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, places like Alexandria and Antioch, which were hotbeds of the Miaphysite Christian faith, a branch of Christianity considered heretical by the Orthodox court in the capital. Whether born from genuine spiritual awakening or brilliant political calculation, or most likely both, Theodora embraced the Miaphysite cause. This was a masterstroke. She, an outcast, aligned herself with an outcast faith that had millions of fervent followers. She was no longer just a disgraced courtesan. She was now a woman of faith, a part of a vast, organized, and powerful international network. She was building her own alliances, her own base of support, one that was completely independent of any patron. When she finally returned to Constantinople, she was a different woman. The girl from the Hippodrome had mastered the stage. The performer had mastered the bedchamber. And now the abandoned mistress had found her own source of power. She had completed her education. She was ready to meet her destiny. When Theodora returned to Constantinople, she was not the same woman who had been cast out by a petty official. The raw material forged in the Hippodrome and sharpened on the stages of the city had been tempered in the fires of exile. She was no longer merely a performer or a courtesan. She was now a political entity in her own right, a woman with a network, a cause, and a will that had been tested by absolute destitution and survived. She established herself in a small house, living a life of quiet industry, spinning wool. But this was a performance of a different kind. It was a display of pious modesty, a public disavowal of her past. And from this house, she became a quiet center of gravity, drawing the attention of the city's most important man, Flavius Petrus Sabatius Justinianus. Justinian, the nephew of the reigning Emperor Justin and the undisputed heir to the Roman world. What happened next was not a romance. It was a collision of destinies, an event so socially and legally impossible that it shook the very foundations of the empire. For Justinian did not simply want Theodora as a mistress. He wanted her as his wife. He wanted to make her his empress. To achieve this, he would have to conquer a series of sacred, ancient rituals designed specifically to prevent a woman like Theodora from ever touching the throne. This was to be her final, most difficult education, the mastery of the rituals of the imperial court. The first ritual was a battle against the dead. It was a war against the full, unyielding weight of Roman law. For centuries, a clear and unambiguous statute, first codified under the Emperor Augustus, forbade any man of senatorial rank from marrying an actress. The law was not a mere suggestion. It was a cornerstone of Roman social order, a legal firewall designed to protect the purity and dignity of the ruling class from the perceived filth of the lower orders. Theodora was not just an actress in the eyes of the law. She was the very definition of infamy, a woman whose profession legally stripped her of basic civil rights. For Justinian to marry her would be like a modern head of state attempting to marry a criminal. It was, quite simply, unthinkable. But Justinian was obsessed. The qualities that Theodora had cultivated for survival, her sharp intellect, her deep understanding of human psychology, her fearless command of any room she entered, were the very things that captivated the heir to the throne. He saw in her not a tainted past, but a mind and a will equal to his own. And so, Justinian, the future lawgiver of the empire, began his first great legal project, the systematic destruction of the law that stood in his way. This was Theodora's seventh great lesson, a ritual of power unlike any she had experienced before. All her life, she had learned to navigate, subvert, and survive within systems of power created by others. Now, she was witnessing a man willing to tear the system apart for her sake. The skills she had perfected in the bedroom, the ability to understand a man's deepest motivations, to become the object of his singular obsession, were now being deployed on an imperial scale. Justinian, driven by a passion she almost certainly cultivated, waged a quiet war on the Roman legal code. He lobbied his uncle, the Emperor Justin. He persuaded the conservative and horrified members of the Senate. He argued, cajoled, and threatened until the impossible happened. The ancient law was not merely granted an exception, it was formally repealed. The emperor issued a new edict, one that explicitly permitted reformed actresses to marry into the highest echelons of society, provided they had abandoned their former profession. It was a law written for an audience of one. Justinian had not just bent the rules for Theodora, he had shattered them. She had learned that the desire of a powerful man, if properly channeled, could be a force capable of rewriting history itself. But the law was only the first barrier. The second was far more formidable, for it was not written on parchment, but in the heart of a single, powerful woman. This was the eighth ritual, gaining the approval of the imperial family, a trial by fire personified by the Empress Euphemia. Euphemia, the wife of Emperor Justin, was a woman whose own origins were humble, a former slave and concubine who had clawed her way to the throne. She was living proof that social mobility was possible, and she despised Theodora with every fiber of her being. Euphemia was not just a snob, she was a gatekeeper. Having scrubbed her own past clean, she was ferocious in her defense of the court's newfound respectability. In Theodora, she saw not a reflection of her own journey, but a grotesque caricature of it, a woman whose sins were too public, whose reputation was too scandalous, whose ambition was too naked. To Euphemia, Theodora was a threat to the fragile dignity of the throne she had worked so hard to secure. The battle between these two women was not fought with armies or laws. It was a war of whispers, of courtly maneuvering, of silent, implacable opposition. For years, as long as Euphemia lived, the marriage was impossible. Justinian could repeal the laws of Augustus, but he could not overcome the will of his aunt. This was a new kind of test for Theodora. The actress knew how to command a stage. The courtesan knew how to charm a patron. But now she had to learn the art of imperial patience. She had to learn to wait. This was a ritual of silent endurance, a game of quiet, strategic positioning within the gilded cage of the palace. She had to be impeccable, to give Euphemia no ammunition, to prove through her conduct that the actress was truly dead. She had to win over allies in the court, to build her own faction, to become an asset that Justinian could not afford to lose. She waited, and she watched. And then, in the year 524, Empress Euphemia died. The final human obstacle between Theodora and the throne was gone. The system's last champion had fallen. With the law changed and the empress gone, the path was clear for the ninth and final ritual, the one that would complete her transformation: the coronation. In the spring of 527, Justin and Justinian were proclaimed co-emperors, and in a ceremony of breathtaking splendor in the heart of the Hagia Sophia, Theodora was crowned Augusta, empress and co-ruler of the Roman world. Imagine this moment. The heavy scent of incense hangs in the air, catching in the shafts of light that pierce the cathedral's great dome. The combined choirs of the city chant ancient hymns, their voices echoing in the cavernous space. The highest officials of the church and state, men who once would have spat at the mention of her name, now bow their heads in reverence. Theodora walks down the aisle, no longer the half-naked performer from the theater, but a figure shrouded in layers of silk and cloth of gold, a living icon. The weight of the purple imperial robes, the same color she would one day call a fine shroud, settles on her shoulders. The patriarch places a diamond-encrusted diadem upon her head, anointing her with holy oil, sanctifying her. This was the ultimate performance. Every lesson she had ever learned was being put to use. The roar of the adoring crowd outside was the roar of the Hippodrome. But now it was for her. Her perfect, regal composure was that of the actress, but the stage was now the holiest altar in Christendom. Her serene understanding of the power dynamics in the room was the knowledge of the courtesan, but now it was being legitimized by God and state. This was more than a ceremony, it was a metamorphosis. The chrysalis of the gutter, the stage, and the bedchamber had finally broken open. The creature that emerged was something new, something the Empire had never seen before. Theodora, the daughter of the bear-keeper, was gone. Theodora, the actress, was gone. Theodora, the courtesan, was gone. In their place stood Theodora, Augusta, Empress of Rome. She had not just survived the brutal rituals of her world. She had conquered them. She had mastered the system so completely that the system had no choice but to kneel before her. The transformation was complete, and so we returned to the imperial council chamber, to the smoke, the screams, and the moment of truth. We returned to the Nika revolt and the Empress who refused to run. Now, her words no longer sound merely brave, they sound inevitable. Now, her unflinching courage is no longer a mystery. It is the logical conclusion of a lifetime spent in the fire. When Theodora looked out at the chaos threatening to consume her throne, what did she see? She saw the Hippodrome. She saw the howling, fickle, violent mob that had been her first teacher. It was the same beast she had seen crown charioteers as gods and tier magistrates limb from limb. It was the same crowd before which she had prostrated herself as a child, learning the bitter taste of public humiliation. She had spent her entire youth studying its moods, memorizing its rhythms, and absorbing its savage language. The senators and generals in the room saw an apocalyptic force of nature. Theodora saw a familiar opponent. She had faced this monster her entire life. It did not frighten her. When she looked at the terrified men around her, including her own husband, what did she see? She saw the patrons from the theater and the clients from the bedchamber. She saw men whose secret weaknesses, hidden fears, and fragile egos she had learned to read like a book. She had spent years mastering the art of manipulating the male psyche, of understanding the delicate interplay between pride and panic. She knew that their authority, like her own, was a performance, and she could see that they were forgetting their lines. Her speech was not just a burst of defiance, it was the calculated intervention of a master psychologist. A perfectly timed performance designed to shame them back into their roles, to remind them of the imperial parts they were supposed to play. And when she declared that purple makes a fine shroud, what was she truly saying? She was invoking the ultimate lesson of her entire existence. Power, once attained, is absolute. To retreat from it, to become a fugitive, was a fate worse than death. It was to return to the powerlessness of her childhood, to become the abandoned woman in Alexandria once more. Theodora had not clawed her way out of the gutter only to flee at the first sign of real danger. The imperial purple was not just a costume to her. It was the culmination of every scar, every humiliation, every bitter lesson she had ever endured. To give it up would be to invalidate her entire life. Death in that palace, wrapped in the robes of an empress, was an infinitely better fate than a long, safe life in the obscurity to which she had been born. She was not choosing death over safety, she was choosing identity over existence. Theodora's legacy is a paradox. She was a product of a system that was misogynistic, brutal, and obsessed with social purity. The rituals of Byzantine society, the public shaming in the arena, the institutionalized debauchery of the theater, the transactional nature of intimacy, were all designed to keep women like her subjugated, to use them and discard them. Yet, it was precisely these cruel and unforgiving rituals that acted as her crucible. The Hippodrome taught her politics. The stage taught her psychology. The bedchamber taught her state secrets. The system, in its relentless effort to define and contain her, had inadvertently given her every tool she needed to master it, and ultimately to save it from itself. She went on to rule alongside Justinian as a true equal, and in many cases as the dominant force. She championed the rights of women, passing laws against forced prostitution, and giving women more power in divorce cases. She was a ruthless political operator, destroying her enemies with a precision learned over a lifetime of observation. She was a devout protector of her chosen faith, using her imperial power to shield the Miaphysite Christians she had embraced in her exile. She was complex, contradictory, and utterly brilliant. She was never a saint. She was something far more interesting. A survivor, forged into a ruler. The story of Theodora is more than just a biography. It is a chilling reminder that the most oppressive systems often create the very agents of their own unforeseen destiny. They can forge weapons without ever realizing it. Her life forces us to look beyond the accepted narratives of history and ask a more difficult question. Who else have we underestimated? Whose education are we ignoring, simply because their classroom is the gutter, the factory floor, or the back alley? What modern Theodora is being forged right now in the fires of a system designed to keep her down? History, after all, is not just a story of emperors and generals. It is a story of survival. And sometimes the greatest survivors learn their lessons in the harshest of schools. Theodora's ghost reminds us that the line between the outcast and the empress is not as clear as we think. It is a line that can be crossed by anyone with enough intelligence, enough ambition, and a will of iron forged in the crucible of a merciless world.